The grand design of the galactic concord was not drawn by mortal hands. It was computed. For 6,000 years, the great artificial intellects of Prime Alpha, gigantic quantum brains suspended in lakes of liquid helium, had calculated every bolt, every weld, and every stress vector for every structure in known space. If a T-Lin corporate clan wanted to build a trade spire, they didn't hire an architect, they input the economic and structural requirements into the core, and 5 seconds later, a perfect, unbending blueprint was printed onto crystalline sheets. Because the math was always perfect, the galaxy had forgotten what an eraser looked like. They had forgotten the small, chaotic scratch of graphite on paper, the smell of old ink, and the nervous weight of a hand drawing a line that might be wrong. To the highborn species, humanity's approach to engineering was not just primitive, it was deeply offensive. The humans didn't use quantum predictive modeling for everything. They kept physical books. They kept libraries of dead paper on their industrial station, the Draft, which sat in the dry, freezing orbit of a dead gas giant at the edge of Sector 12. The Draft was an ugly, sprawling ring of old cargo containers, heavy crane platforms, and structural trusses held together by manual friction welds and sheer human stubbornness. It was a place where old blueprints went to collect dust, and where human engineers spent their time reading the footnotes of history. Inside the central archival vault, the air was intentionally dry, cold, and smelled heavily of old wood pulp and chemical binding agents. Rows of iron shelves stretched up into the dim yellow light, packed with leather-bound logs, technical manuals from Earth's pre-space era, and massive rolls of blue structural paper that had been printed before the first human hyperengine had ever ignited. Caleb Cross was sitting at a heavy oak desk in the center of the vault, a pair of brass-rimmed magnifying glasses resting on his nose. He was 36 years old, with sleeves rolled up to his elbows, showing forearms that were permanently stained with the gray grease of drafting ink. His fingers were calloused from the rough edges of heavy paper, and on his desk sat a simple, mechanical pencil that used real, physical graphite leads. Click. Caleb pressed the top of the pencil, extending a fresh millimeter of dark gray lead. He didn't look at the massive holographic monitors that blinked on the walls behind him, his eyes were fixed on an old, handwritten logbook from an industrial salvage ship that had gone missing 90 years ago. "You are wasting biological energy, human," a booming, deep voice rumbled through the quiet room. Standing in the doorway was High Inspector Kale, one of the 2 Torvan oversight officers assigned to the station. Kale was a massive creature, 7 feet tall, with a thick, rock-like hide that looked like gray granite. He wore the polished, gold-trimmed uniform of the Concord Engineering Bureau, and his heavy boots made the iron floor plates groan as he walked. The Concord Engineering Council has already issued its final declaration on the Sector 12 Gate project, Kale said, his digital translation collar translating his deep rumblings into flat, mechanical English. The central quantum brain has run the simulation 4,000 times. The structural stress from the localized gravity well cannot be resolved. The project is abandoned. The files are sealed. It is mathematically impossible to stabilize the core. Caleb didn't look up immediately. He slowly ran his finger down the margin of the yellowed paper, reading a small, handwritten note scribbled in the margin by a dead human technician named Miller. "The gauge on the main pressure valve don't account for the slosh in the tank when the pumps kick back. Add 2 inches of rubber gasket to the seal or she'll leak every time." Caleb smiled softly, setting the book down and looking up at the giant rock-skinned alien. "The central quantum brain is smart, Kale," Caleb said, his voice quiet but steady. "But it only knows how to read the numbers you give it. It doesn't know how to look at the mistakes people made when they were building the foundation. It doesn't know how to read between the lines." "There are no lines to read between," Kale retorted, his heavy stone brow furrowing. "Engineering is a science of absolute values. If the algorithm says the metal will fatigue and shatter under 40,000 metric tons of pressure, then the metal will shatter. The galaxy's greatest engineers, the T-Lin masters, the Krail system builders, they have all signed the abandonment decree. They packed their bags and left this morning. They did not even finish their coffee." "Yeah, well, humans don't like leaving a book half-read," Caleb said, picking up his mechanical pencil and drawing a small, clean circle on a fresh sheet of white paper. The galaxy's greatest engineers looked at the summary page on the screen and walked away. But they didn't look at the appendix. They didn't read the footnotes. He stood up, his canvas work trousers stiff with dried grease, and slung a heavy canvas tool bag over his shoulder. The physical weight of iron wrenches and steel calipers clattered against his hip with a loud, purposeful clink. "Where are you going?" Cale demanded, his rock-like fists clenching. "The sector gate is currently undergoing structural decay. The gravity well is expanding. It is a restricted hazard zone." "I'm going down to the core," Caleb said, walking past the giant inspector without breaking his stride. "Because I just found a handwritten diary from an old railworker who built the infrastructure for the old Mars colonies. He spent 40 pages talking about how to handle structural slosh in a high-gravity environment. I think the core forgot to account for the rubber." The Sector 12 gate was a monument to galactic failure. It was a massive, ring-shaped superstructure that hovered in the empty space between three dead stars, designed to open a stable hyperspatial highway directly into the rich, untouched resource fields of the core. It was 5 kilometers wide, a beautiful, silver circle of hyper-advanced crystalline alloy that had cost 3 billion Concord credits to assemble. But right now, it looked like a dying giant. The central ring was trembling, a low, deep vibration that could be felt through the hull of any ship within 20 kilometers. A localized gravitational anomaly, a tiny, artificial black hole that had been generated to power the gate, had gone unstable, pulling the internal frameworks inward and twisting the 5-kilometer ring into an erratic, broken oval. The luxury transport ships of the T-Lin and Crail engineering teams were already distant sparks on the long-range sensors, fleeing back toward the safe, predictable sectors of the core. They had left everything behind: automated welding platforms, millions of credits of diagnostic equipment, and the massive, glowing holographic blueprints that still floated in the empty maintenance offices of the gate's command ring. Caleb's ship, the T-Square, was an old, rust-pitted industrial tugboat that looked like a square iron box with 4 massive chemical thrusters bolted to the back. It didn't have the clean anti-gravity fields of the alien cruisers. It rattled so loudly when the engines fired that Caleb had to wedge pieces of old cardboard into the console seams to keep the plastic from screaming. Beside him in the cockpit sat Dr. Lin, the station's chief structural historian. She was 60 years old, with gray hair tied back in a neat bun, and she was currently holding a massive, leather-bound volume of old railway blueprints from 19th-century Earth on her lap. The core ran the calculations based on the assumption that the crystalline alloy behaves like a uniform fluid under gravitational stress, Lin said, her glasses slipping down her nose as the ship shook from a nearby gravity wave. "It's a perfect mathematical model. But it assumes the metal is clean." "The metal isn't clean," Caleb said, his hands locked onto the heavy, manual hydraulic steering joysticks of the tug. "They built this gate out here in Sector 12, right next to a dead gas giant that's been throwing off iron-rich silicate dust for 10 million years. The assembly line drones didn't clean the joints between the welds because the core's sensors told them the dust layer was too thin to matter." "A microscopic layer of dust," Lin muttered, turning a heavy, yellowed page of her book with careful fingers. "In a normal system, it wouldn't change the structural load by a single fraction of a percent. But under 8,000 atmospheres of gravitational pull, it acts like sandpaper," Caleb finished. "It introduces friction where the computer thinks there's smooth sliding. The whole thing is locking up because it's trying to move according to a formula that doesn't account for dirt." The T-Square rounded the massive, curved outer hull of the gate. The searchlights of the tug cut through the thick, purple cloud of silicate dust, illuminating the primary engineering junction. It was a total mess. The main support beams, which were as thick as apartment buildings, were groaning under the pressure. Massive, 3-foot-thick crystalline bolts were stripping their threads, loud bangs echoing through the structure like artillery fire as the metal gave way. Inside the gate's main maintenance office, the digital holoscreens were flashing a single, large red symbol in the universal language of the Concorde: abandon. But Caleb didn't look at the screens. He landed the T-Square with a hard, mechanical thud against the secondary docking collar, locking the manual iron clamps with a heavy clatter. He stood up, unhitched his safety harness, and grabbed his physical canvas notebook from the dashboard. "The Torvin inspector says we're violating direct orders," Lynn said, looking at her communicator as it beeped with frantic messages from High Inspector Cale back on the station. "He says if we don't turn back, they'll revoke our salvage licenses." Caleb pulled his heavy leather work gloves onto his hands, tightening the straps with his teeth. "Cale can have my license when he learns how to read something that doesn't have a screen, Doctor," Caleb said, cracking the manual iron handle of the airlock door. "Let's go find the page they missed." The interior of the gate's main engineering spine was a labyrinth of pure, mechanical terror. Without the station's central stabilizers, the gravity inside the corridors was shifting wildly every few minutes. One moment Caleb felt as light as a feather, his boots floating off the floor, the next, an invisible weight would slam into his shoulders, forcing his knees to buckle against the cold metal floor plates. Every alien species had left their diagnostic units behind. The floor was littered with small, hovering silver spheres, T-Lin data drones, that were still blinking their small blue lights, repeating the same mechanical message into the empty corridors: simulation complete. Solution set, null. Evacuate immediately. Caleb and Dr. Lin moved down the maintenance tube, their heavy iron tools clattering inside their bags with every shift in the gravity field. They finally reached the main core junction, the place where the 5-kilometer ring connected to the massive gravitational engines that powered the portal. The junction was a massive, spherical chamber, 500 feet across. In the center, a swirling vortex of purple and white energy, the artificial singularity, was trapped inside a cage of magnetic containment rings. But the rings were no longer circular. They were bending inward, turning into a jagged star shape as the structural frame of the gate collapsed around them. Standing on the central maintenance catwalk was a single, tiny figure. It was an old T-Lin engineer named Spren, the only non-human who hadn't fled with the fleet. He was a small, insectoid creature with 4 delicate, silver arms, and he was currently sitting on the floor with his back against a dead control console, his long antennae drooped flat against his head in absolute resignation. "The calculation is finished, humans," Spren clicked weakly as Caleb's heavy boots clanged onto the catwalk. The alien didn't lift his head. His delicate silver hands were holding a small, digital data pad that was frozen on a screen full of red zeros. "The core has closed the processing loop. The structural fatigue has reached the point of terminal divergence. In exactly 3 hours, the magnetic rings will touch the singularity, and this entire sector will be turned into a cloud of atomic dust. It is an unalterable geometric law." Caleb walked over to the main structural joint where the primary containment ring met the gate's outer spine. He didn't look at the digital sensors. He reached out with his bare leather glove, wiping away a thick layer of fine, gray silicate dust from the massive crystalline hinge. Beneath the dust, the metal wasn't cracked. It was scored, deep, jagged scratches ran across the surface of the hinge where the parts were supposed to slide past each other smoothly. "It's not fatigue, Spren," Caleb said, his voice echoing loudly in the massive chamber over the deep, oceanic roar of the singularity. "It's a friction lock. The hinge is jammed because it's full of dirt." "The core does not account for dirt," Spren clicked, his antennae twitching with a faint spark of irritation. "The core calculates material behavior based on pure crystalline purity. Dirt is an irregular variable. It cannot be modeled in a standard quantum matrix. That's why you don't use a quantum matrix to fix a jammed door," Caleb said. He sat down on the metal floor of the catwalk, pulled his physical notebook from his pocket, and flipped open the pages. The notebook was full of his own hand-drawn sketches, structural cross-sections, and columns of manual long-division math that he had done with his graphite pencil. But at the very back of the book was a photostatic copy of an old document from Earth, dated 1942. It was a technical brief for the construction of heavy railway bridges over the muddy rivers of the American Midwest. Dr. Lin knelt down beside him, her small reading light illuminating the yellowed page. "Look here," Caleb said, pointing his finger at a small, printed footnote at the very bottom of page 114. The chief engineer on the Ohio project had to build a rotating steel span in the middle of a silt-heavy R. Sven leaned forward slightly, his compound eyes reflecting the purple glow of the singularity as he stared at the primitive paper book. What did this slide rule technician do? He didn't try to build a tighter seal to keep the dirt out, Caleb said, a hard, confident grin breaking across his face. He built a purge channel. He cut an intentional groove into the side of the bearing, so that every time the bridge rotated, the pressure of the movement itself squeezed the mud out through the side. He turned the friction into a pump. He looked up at the massive, groaning crystalline containment rings above them. The T-Lin engineers built these hinges to be perfectly smooth, with zero tolerance, Caleb said, standing up and grabbing a heavy, 6-foot iron pry bar from his tool bag. When the dust got in, the parts had nowhere to go, so they locked up. If we can cut an intentional gap into the primary relief valve, if we can give the dirt a place to escape, the whole ring will snap back into alignment. Cut a gap? Sven squeaked, his wings buzzing with pure horror. You want to damage the pristine geometry of a Concorde core engine? With an iron bar? That is not engineering. That is vandalism. Out here on the rim, Sven, Caleb growled, slamming the tip of the iron bar into the seam of the jammed hinge with a sharp, metallic clang, we call it a tune-up. Lin. Get the plasma torch. We've got 2 hours to read the rest of this page. For 90 minutes, the central chamber of Gate 12 didn't look like a high-tech galactic marvel. It looked like an old locomotive repair shop from the industrial age. The air was thick with the sharp, chemical smell of burning metal and hot grease as Caleb and Dr. Lin worked on the primary containment hinge. Maya, Caleb's younger apprentice, had arrived from the T-square with a massive, old-fashioned oxyacetylene torch, a human tool that used real chemical gases to create a blinding, blue-white flame that could cut through armor plating. She was hanging upside down from a safety harness 40 feet above the catwalk, her face hidden behind a dark welding mask as she blasted a deep, jagged groove into the side of the crystalline core housing. Sparks flew from the metal like a shower of falling stars, raining down into the purple light of the singularity below. The gravity index is hitting 3.6 gs. Dr. Lin shouted over the deafening roar of the torch. She was sitting at a secondary terminal, her hands flying across an old manual keyboard she had spliced into the alien control lines. The magnetic rings are beginning to deform again. Caleb. If that hinge doesn't release in 5 minutes, the structural warp will be irreversible. Caleb was standing on a narrow maintenance platform right next to the massive scoring lines on the hinge. His face was covered in a thick layer of black soot and gray silicate dust, his uniform shirt soaked through with sweat. In his hands, he held a 20-pound steel sledgehammer, an ancient, brutal tool that had no business being within a mile of a quantum-stabilized core. He looked up at Maya. Maya. Cut is deep enough. Get clear of the line. Maya shut off the torch, the sudden silence in the chamber filled only by the deep, rhythmic thrumming of the dying gravity well. She swung her harness back toward the safety rail, clearing the area. Sven. Caleb called out to the old T-Lin engineer, who was huddled behind a reinforced bulkhead, his 4 arms wrapped tightly around his head. When I hit this housing, the friction lock is going to release all at once. Tell the computer to dump the magnetic pressure into the secondary arrays the exact microsecond you hear the metal pop. Don't wait for the computer to verify the calculation, just hit the manual override. The manual override violates 42 separate safety protocols. Sven squeaked through his translator. If the pressure distribution is off by a single millimeter, the entire structural ring will explode inward. Then don't be off by a millimeter, Caleb said. He widened his stance on the narrow platform. The gravity shifted again, suddenly making his 20-pound hammer feel like it weighed 80 pounds. His human muscles strained, his heart pounding furiously against his ribs as he lifted the heavy steel block over his shoulder. He didn't look at a digital targeting reticle. He looked at the tiny, gray line of silicate dust trapped inside the groove Maya had just cut. He remembered the handwritten note from Miller's logbook from 90 years ago, hit her right on the shoulder of the valve, and she'll pop clean every time. Caleb swung. The steel hammer hit the crystalline housing with a sound that was louder than a lightning strike. Crack. A blinding flash of white kinetic energy erupted from the impact point. The iron bar in Caleb's hands vibrated so violently it tore the leather gloves from his palms, sending him stumbling backward against High. For one terrifying second, nothing happened. The station held its breath. Then, a deep, grinding roar shook the entire 5-kilometer structure. The massive crystalline hinge, suddenly given a place for the trapped dust to escape, slid forward. A huge cloud of gray silicate dust exploded out of the newly cut purge channel, shooting into the void like smoke from a cannon barrel. With a massive, systemic slam that could be felt through the boots of every engineer, the 5-kilometer ring of Gate 12 snapped back into a perfect, geometric circle. Now, Sven. Hit it now. Caleb screamed, his hands raw and bleeding. Sven didn't look at his data pad. He didn't wait for the quantum brain on Prime Alpha to verify the structural load. He reached out with all 4 of his silver hands and slammed them down onto the big, mechanical red emergency buttons on the manual dashboard. The purple vortex of the singularity in the center of the chamber instantly stabilized. The jagged star shape of the magnetic ring smoothed out into a perfect, glowing halo of clean white energy. The groaning in the walls stopped. The erratic gravity field vanished, replaced by the steady, comforting 1G hum of the station's regular internal stabilizers. The massive chamber went dead quiet, except for the soft, steady purr of the stabilized singularity. Sven slowly lowered his 4 hands, his long antennae rising up from his head, trembling with absolute disbelief. He looked at his digital data pad, then up at the perfect circle of the containment ring, and finally down at the short, soot-stained human mechanic who was currently sitting on the catwalk, wrapping a piece of white cloth around his bleeding palms. The geometry is perfect, Sven whispered, his digital translator clicking with a tone of profound awe. The core has achieved a stability rating that is higher than the original factory specifications. The quantum brain, it said it was an impossibility. Caleb pulled the knot tight on his hand bandage with his teeth, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his stubby gray graphite pencil. He picked up his canvas notebook from the floor, turned to a fresh page, and drew a single, clean checkmark next to his long division calculations. The quantum brain reads the book the factory wrote, Sven, Caleb said, his voice raspy but full of a quiet, unshakable pride. But out here on the rim, we're the ones who have to write the sequel. The news of Gate 12 survival spread through the galactic concord like a high-frequency data pulse. Within 6 hours, the fleet of luxury alien transport ships that had fled the sector came to a sudden, awkward halt in deep space. The Teelin corporate masters and the Krail system builders turned their sleek vessels around, their navigation computers confirming that the red zone hazard had completely vanished, replaced by a perfectly stable, high-capacity hyperspatial portal waiting for trade traffic. When the flagship of the Concord Engineering Bureau, a beautiful, golden spire that was 2 kilometers long, docked with the gate's command ring, the high officials didn't find an elite team of scientists waiting for them. They found Caleb Cross. He was sitting in the middle of the main office, his heavy work boots resting on top of a 1,000,000-credit holographic display terminal that he had turned off to save power. He was eating a cold ham sandwich out of a tin lunchbox, his face still covered in a thin layer of gray silicate dust and black engine grease. Beside him, Old Man Miller was sleeping in a chair with his pipe in his mouth, and Dr. Lin was busy cataloging a fresh stack of handwritten engineering journals they had salvaged from the gate's lower storage bins. The door to the office hissed open, and a grand delegation of alien engineers walked in. At the front was High Inspector Kale, his rock-like hide polished for the formal arrival, accompanied by the Teelin chief engineer, a brilliant but arrogant creature named Master Zyler, who wore a coat made of pure, iridescent silver thread. Zyler's compound eyes swept across the room, focusing on the dark holoscreens and the physical paper books scattered across the desks with visible disgust. "Where is the secondary computational unit?" Master Zyler asked, his digital translation key projecting a high-pitched, aristocratic tone into the room. Our long-range diagnostic networks show that a profound structural recalculation was performed within the core. We have come to receive the algorithms from your main database so we can upload them to the central core on Prime Alpha. Caleb took a slow bite of his sandwich, chewed thoughtfully, and swallowed before speaking. There isn't an algorithm, Master Xyler, Caleb said simply, pointing his finger at the greasy canvas notebook sitting on his knee. There's just this. A groove cut into the side of the housing, and a 20-pound hammer hit right on the sweet spot. Xyler's lawn. Outside, the portal was beautiful. A smooth, shimmering sheet of white hyperspatial energy was stretched across the center of the circle, perfectly stable, completely unaffected by the purple dust cloud that was still swirling around the edges of the sector. You guys spend all your time trying to make the universe fit into a perfect little equation, Caleb said, his voice dropping into that hard, steady rumble that left no room for corporate arguments. You build your ships clean, you build your stations clean, and the second a little bit of dirt gets into the gears, your giant quantum brains look at the math, throw their hands up in the air, and tell you to run away because it's mathematically impossible. He turned back to face the delegation, his calloused hands resting on his tool belt. But the universe isn't clean, Caleb said. It's full of dust, it's full of friction, and it's full of things that don't care about your factory warranties. Humans don't give up when the screen turns red. We read one more page. We find the guy who made the mistake 100 years ago, and we figure out how he fixed it with a piece of rubber and a hammer. High Inspector Kale stepped forward, his stone chest heaving as he looked from the human mechanic to the old T-Lin engineer, Sven, who was currently standing in the back of the room, holding an old physical drafting pencil in his silver claw with a look of intense concentration. The Engineering Council, Kale rumbled slowly, his deep voice heavy with a strange new tone that sounded very much like humility, will require a complete manual report of this operation. They wish to know how to calculate the purge channel value for future installations. Caleb reached into his pocket, pulled out his stubby graphite pencil, and tossed it across the room. The little wooden stick flipped through the air, landing perfectly on top of Master Xyler's silver-threaded coat before rolling onto the floor. Don't calculate it, Caleb said, picking up his lunchbox and walking toward the door. Just buy a book. And make sure you read the footnotes. The immediate result of the Sector 12 correction was an administrative nightmare for the Galactic Concord. For 6,000 years, the Engineering Bureau had operated on a simple hierarchy. The species with the highest computational capacity made the decisions, and everyone else followed the printouts. The T-Lin were at the top, the Torvins handled the heavy structural logistics, and humanity was left at the bottom, given the small, dirty repair contracts that were beneath the dignity of the Core's master builders. But within 3 weeks of Gate 12's activation, the traffic numbers shook the Core. The portal wasn't just working, it was handling 20% more weight than the central quantum brain had ever predicted. The small, intentional purge channels that Caleb's team had cut into the hinges allowed the gate to expand and contract naturally as the gas giant's dust storms rolled through the sector. The structure was breathing, a concept that didn't exist in the rigid, sterile language of alien mathematics. Back on the draft, the human station had become an unlikely pilgrimage site. The long, rusty docking bays were no longer filled with abandoned scrap cargo. They were crowded with high-class alien shuttles. Young T-Lin engineers, fresh from the corporate academies of the Central Worlds, stepped off their sleek ships carrying digital tablets, their eyes wide with curiosity as they walked through the grease-scented corridors of the human scrap ring. They had come to see the archive of frozen schemes. Caleb Cross sat at his oak desk, his magnifying glasses resting on his nose, a fresh cup of bitter black coffee steam rising into the dry air of the vault. Sitting on the stool across from him was Sven, the old T-Lin engineer. Sven had refused to return to his corporate position on Prime Alpha. Instead, he had bought a pair of human work overalls, which were far too big for his thin insectoid frame, and was currently using a physical graphite pencil to draw a series of complex, hand-drawn gear systems on a sheet of blue drafting paper. The line must be straight, Sven, Caleb said without looking up from his own book, his pencil ticking softly against his teeth. Don't ask the computer to straighten it for you. Feel the paper with your claw. If your hand is shaking, the line will tell you. That's how you know you're working, not just processing. Sven let out a soft, clicking sound that passed for a chuckle. It is an inefficient method of draftsmanship, Caleb. My silver claws are designed for microsurgical contact interfaces, not for scraping carbon dust onto wood pulp. But if you make a mistake on that paper, Sven, Caleb said, leaning forward and tapping the page with his finger, you have to look at it. You can't just press undo and pretend it never happened. You have to. Caleb, Lynn said, her face serious but her eyes bright with professional excitement. We just got a Priority 1 communication from the Central Bureau on Prime Alpha. They've run into a problem with the construction of the New Horizon spire. Caleb sighed, setting his pencil down on the desk with a sharp clink. The spire? That's that 100-story orbital platform they're building over the water worlds of Sector 4, right? What's wrong? Did the quantum brain get a headache? Worse, Lynn said, unfolding a massive, holographic data sheet onto the table. The image showed a towering, needle-thin structure that stretched from the ocean's surface all the way into upper orbit. The central support spine was flashing a bright, angry orange. The foundation is sinking into the deep-sea silt, Lynn explained. The T-Lin built the anchor blocks out of high-density crystalline stone, but the water currents are creating an irregular harmonic vibration. The stones are shifting. The core algorithm says the entire tower will tip over into the ocean within 48 hours. The master builders have already called for a controlled demolition. Caleb looked at the flashing orange lines of the holographic tower. He didn't touch the controls. He slowly turned his head, his eyes traveling down the long iron rows of the library shelves until they settled on a thick, dusty volume bound in faded green sailcloth at the very bottom of shelf 4. The title on the spine was barely visible through the grime, Report on the Construction of the Eddystone Lighthouse, Plymouth, England, 1759. Caleb smiled, a slow, grim expression that Sven had learned to recognize as a sign of impending structural vandalism. Sven, Caleb said, standing up and grabbing his heavy canvas tool bag from the floor. Pack your overalls. We're going to go teach the master builders how to build a stone tower that knows how to dance. The water world of Sector 4 was a place of endless, gray oceans and violent, perpetual storms. When the T-square dropped out of hyperspace, the view through the front cockpit viewport was dominated by a wall of dark, rain-swept clouds. Cutting through the storm like a giant silver needle was the New Horizon spire. It was a magnificent structure, 5 miles high, a testament to the heights that galactic engineering could reach when money was no object. But right now, the needle was crooked. The water around the base of the spire was a churning white foam, whipped into a frenzy by the high-speed ocean currents and the massive hydraulic stabilizers that were desperately trying, and failing, to push the 5-mile tower back into alignment. The luxury transport ships of the T-Lin corporate masters were already lined up in the upper atmosphere, their engines glowing with a dull orange light as they prepared to watch the controlled demolition of their own masterpiece. They had already run the numbers. The spire was a dead loss, an expensive monument to an unpredictable ocean. Caleb guided the T-square through the screaming wind, the old tugboat slamming into the heavy waves with a series of deafening smacks that threw spray completely over the cockpit window. Beside him, Sven was locked into his seat with 4 separate safety harnesses, his long insectoid legs shivering as the ship tilted at a 45-degree angle. The wave velocity exceeds safe parameters for a salvage vessel. Sven clicked frantically over the internal intercom. The computational matrix says our hull will undergo structural failure if we enter the lower foundation splash zone. Your matrix doesn't know how thick our plates are, Sven. Caleb shouted back over the roar of the engines, his hands wrestling with the hydraulic joysticks. Lynn. Where's the primary ballast connection on this tower? Dr. Lynn was sitting in the back, her fingers holding open the green sailcloth book from 1759, her eyes skimming the manual hand-drawn diagrams of interlocking stone blocks. The T-Lin built the underwater anchor blocks like perfect cubes. Lin called out. They stacked them on top of each other with zero gap, using a magnetic locking gel to hold them in place. But the silt under the ocean is moving like fluid grease. Every time a wave hits the top of the tower, the energy travels down the spine and causes the lower blocks to slide past each other like ice on ice. Because they're cubes. Caleb yelled, a hard realization hitting his mind. A cube is great in a computer simulation where the ground is a solid slate of iron. But in real mud, a cube has nothing to hold on to. It's like trying to build a castle on top of marbles. He slammed the thruster levers forward, guiding the T-square directly into the dark, swirling vortex of foam at the base of the crooked spire. The primary engineering office of the lower foundation ring was a chaotic mess of flashing red warnings. The central holographic projector was showing a three-dimensional model of the. Look at this, Caleb said, pointing his graphite pencil at the drawing. The guy who built this tower didn't have magnetic locking gel, and he didn't have high-density crystalline alloy. He had granite, lime mortar, and a brain that understood how water actually moves. He didn't try to fight the friction, he used the weight of the tower itself to press the interlocking joints tighter together. The harder the storm hits the top, the tighter the bottom locks up. Director Vale leaned closer to the paper, his antennae twitching with a mixture of professional confusion and deep arrogance. This design is non-linear, Vale clicked, his wings buzzing with irritation. It has no uniform stress distribution. The central core cannot calculate the loading patterns for a geometric shape that has 42 individual curved facets per block. It is an irregular structure. It is uncomputable. Then stop trying to compute it and look at the water. Caleb yelled, pointing through the massive reinforced glass viewport at the churning gray sea outside. The ocean isn't uniform, Director. Your perfect cubes are sliding because they're too stupid to know how to hold on to each other. Maya. Get the heavy salvage clamps from the tug. Sven. Get the manual welding overrides. We're going to go change the shape of those stones before the clock runs out. The underwater foundation of the New Horizon spire was a silent, pressurized world of pure green shadows and churning silt. 40 feet below the storm-swept surface of the ocean, Caleb Cross was hanging from a mechanical guide cable, his heavy steel diving exosuit clicking loudly as the internal hydraulic motors fought against the immense ocean currents. The searchlights of his suit cut through the murky, green water, illuminating the massive, silver blocks of the tower's primary foundation. The blocks were already separating. A 3-foot gap had formed between the upper and lower tiers of the crystalline foundation, and thick plumes of dark gray mud were shooting through the opening like smoke from a broken valve. Maya. Bring the heavy plasma lance. Caleb's voice came through the high-density sonar radio, thick with the heavy sound of his own breathing. We don't have time to recut the whole foundation blocks. We're just going to cut the interlocking slots into the front faces of the primary anchors, and then we're going to drop 20-ton scrap iron wedges down the guidelines to lock them together. Copy that, boss. Maya's voice crackled back through the static. Through the green water, a massive industrial crane line dropped from the belly of the T-square hovering above the waves. Hanging from the line was a huge, rough wedge of solid scrap iron, a piece of a discarded cargo ship structural keel that Caleb had hauled from the junkyard of Sector 9. It was raw, unpolished, and covered in layers of old rust, looking like an ancient stone axe head floating in the futuristic green ocean. Maya moved quickly, her suit's thrusters firing with brief, white bursts of cavitation bubbles as she brought the massive chemical plasma lance into alignment with the crystalline foundation blocks. She ignited the torch. Even underwater, the human lance screamed, a high-pitched, terrifying hiss that turned the surrounding sea water into a boiling cloud of white steam. She began tracing a deep, angular groove into the pristine face of the primary T-Lin anchor cube, mimicking the interlocking joints from the 1759 lighthouse blueprints. The tower is tilting further. Sven's voice came through the sonar network, high-pitched and clicking with pure panic. The old T-Lin engineer was sitting inside the T-square's cockpit, his 4 silver hands locked onto the manual ballast controls as he tried to keep the tugboat from being dragged down by the spire's movement. The structural center of gravity has passed the terminal threshold by 0.04%. The demolition charges are automatically armed. The computer is going to fire them in 4 minutes. Director Vale. Caleb roared into his radio, his heavy steel gloves slamming against the crystalline wall of the Foundation as a massive underwater wave hit his suit, nearly breaking his safety line. Deactivate those charges. We're cutting the slot now. The algorithm cannot be stopped manually once the terminal threshold is passed. Vale's voice clicked back through the station relay, cold and defeated. The calculation is absolute. The spire is dead, human. Get out of the area before the explosions destroy your vessel. I don't care about your algorithm, Director. Caleb screamed. He unhitched his safety harness from the guide cable, letting the heavy ocean current grab his suit. He used his thrusters to blast himself directly onto the top of the 20-ton scrap iron wedge hanging from the crane line. He grabbed a manual, high-impact pneumatic chisel from his utility belt, a heavy, mechanical tool that used pressurized air lines to deliver 60 industrial hammer blows per second. Maya. Cut is clear. Caleb yelled. Release the secondary crane brake. Drop the wedge. Maya shut off the plasma lance, and the sudden clearance of the steam cloud revealed a deep, clean, angular slot cut directly into the side of the 2 shifting foundation blocks. Above them, the crane line went slack. The 20-ton block of rough scrap iron dropped through the green water like a falling mountain. It hit the newly cut groove with a sound that was felt more than heard, a massive, deep thump that sent a physical shockwave through the water, knocking Caleb's suit completely upside down and shattering his external searchlights. For 3 seconds, the ocean was dark, filled only with the sound of churning silt and the deep, terrifying groan of 5 miles of silver metal tilting above them. Then, the grinding stopped. The rough, rusted iron wedge, driven down by the immense weight of the ocean and the movement of the spire itself, jammed deep into the crystalline slot. The 2 shifting foundation blocks, which had been sliding apart like ice, were suddenly locked together by the interlocking geometry. The more the tower tried to tilt, the harder its own weight pressed the iron wedge into the crystalline groove, turning the destructive force of the storm into a giant mechanical break. With a loud, systemic clang that echoed through the sub-sea strata, the New Horizon spire stopped moving. System notice, found. Caleb floated in the dark water, his suit's emergency red lights blinking softly inside his helmet. He could hear his own breath, fast and ragged, and the steady, rhythmic click-click-click of his mechanical wristwatch taped to the inside of his visor window. Caleb. Caleb, do you read me? Dr. Lin's voice came through the sonar, her breath catching in a sob of pure relief. The spire has stopped tilting. The sensors on the station show that the foundation load has locked into a static equilibrium. The tower is holding. Caleb turned his suit thrusters on, slowly bringing himself right side up in the murky green darkness. He looked at the massive, ugly wedge of rusted human scrap iron wedged deep into the brilliant, silver crystalline heart of the alien foundation. The tower isn't just holding, Doctor, Caleb gasped, wiping a layer of sweat from his forehead inside his helmet. It's anchored. Tell Director Vale he can turn his demolition screens off. The lighthouse is open for business. The grand spire of Sector 4 did not fall. It stood at a permanent angle of 4.6 degrees, a crooked silver needle cutting through the stormy gray clouds of the water world, looking less like a perfect galactic computation and more like a real, living monument to human stubbornness. The Concorde architects eventually stopped trying to fix the tilt. They realized that the angle actually made the tower more resistant to the high-speed upper atmosphere winds, allowing the structure to deflect the storm currents rather than trying to withstand them with pure material strength. 3 months after the storm, the Great Hall of the Concorde Engineering Bureau on Prime Alpha convened an extraordinary session. The chamber was magnificent, built out of clean white marble and filled with thousands of alien master builders from 400 species. The giant holographic monitors on the walls were displaying the new updates for the Galactic Structural Code, the first changes to be made to the central architectural database in over 2,000 years. Caleb Cross didn't attend the session. He didn't wear a silver coat, and he didn't receive a gold-plated medal from the High Council. He was back on the draft, sitting at his old oak desk in the quiet, dry air of the archival vault. The magnifying glasses were resting on his nose, and the small, mechanical pencil was ticking softly in his fingers as he sketched a new line on a sheet of blue paper. Beside him, Spren was busy organizing a new section of the library. The old T-Lin engineer was carefully placing leather-bound logs from Earth's ancient maritime histories onto the iron shelves, his 4 silver hands moving with an absolute, reverent care. The heavy door of the vault opened with its familiar, rusty groan, and High Inspector Kale walked into the room. The giant Torvan officer wasn't carrying a digital data pad today. He was carrying a large, heavy wooden crate packed with old, physical paper books that had been salvaged from an abandoned colony transport on the Outer Rim. The Central. Enjoyed the story? Subscribe for more HFY sci-fi adventures and share your thoughts below.